The wind that came down from the high ridges carried with it the smell of pine smoke and dust, a strange mixture of comfort and warning. In the late autumn of 1879, the little mountain settlement had already begun to shrink in the cold shadows of winter. Timber cabins stood in a crooked row along the muddy main street, their chimneys puffing gray smoke into the thin air. A few lanterns flickered inside the saloon at the far end, and the sound of an out-of-tune piano rattled against the night like bones being shaken in a tin cup. Yet for all its noise, the town felt uneasy, as if it held its breath against something. Waiting out there in the dark woods, the widow lived on the edge of the settlement, her small cabin perched just where the slope dipped toward the river. Folks often spoke of her with hushed voices, not out of dislike, but because life had struck her harder than most. Her husband had been taken by fever the previous winter, leaving her to work the soil alone, tending to a piece of land that yielded little more than enough to keep her alive. She was young still, with a strength that came from necessity rather than choice. But in those hills a woman alone was seen as both vulnerable and marked. Travelers passing through often asked about her, curious at the sight of a woman who carried water from the well with her back straight, or who swung an axe into cordwood as if she had been born with the skill. The men of the village offered help now and then, but she had grown used to standing on her own. Pride and sorrow had become her shield, though both weighed heavy on her shoulders. And in the West, pride could only protect for so long. The mountain. Man appeared when the first snow touched the ridges. He came out of the timber like a figure half-formed from the wilderness itself. Broad in the shoulders, his beard wild, his eyes pale as winter ice. He carried the air of someone who had lived more years among wolves and storms than among people. No one knew exactly where he hailed from. Some said farther north, beyond the big rivers where the hunting trails grew scarce and the winters punished harder. Others whispered he had left a trail of broken men behind him in some mining town. But all agreed on one thing: he was not the kind to pass through quietly. His first steps into the village caused a silence that clung longer than any wind. Blacksmiths stopped hammering, children stopped their play, and even the mutt that usually barked at strangers slunk away with its tail tucked. The mountain man did not speak much, but when he did, his voice rumbled low, like stones shifting deep in the earth. Folks said you could hear a warning in the way he growled, though his words might seem plain on the surface. When his gaze fell upon the widow, something in the town seemed to change. It wasn't loud or sudden. It was more like the way a storm cloud spreads across a clear sky. Slowly the air thickened. He began showing up near her cabin, sometimes with a bundle of game slung across his shoulders, sometimes only to sharpen his knife by her door without a word. The widow, unused to anyone pressing so close into her quiet life, felt both fear and a strange pull she could not explain. His presence unsettled her, yet it also seemed to promise something she dared not speak aloud: survival. In a land that often chose the strong over the gentle, the people of the town watched and whispered. Some thought she should accept his shadow as protection, for a woman alone was often left to the mercy of harder men. Others feared that the mountain man's claim would draw trouble from beyond. His kind carried enemies the way the forest carried wolves. Whatever side they stood on, none dared confront him directly. His silence alone was enough to keep questions locked in men's throats. On one biting evening, when the lanterns in the saloon were just flickering to life, the mountain man's voice carried down the street. He stood before her cabin door, and though the words were simple, they struck every ear like a hammer against iron. "Your body is mine until I have my sons," he growled, his eyes steady on the widow's. A hush fell over the settlement. Men lowered their heads, women clutched shawls tighter, and the widow herself froze as though the ground beneath her had given way. The words were not shouted, yet they thundered louder than gunfire. They were not a request, not even a threat, but a declaration carved into the night like a brand on fresh wood. The widow's heart beat against her ribs, not only from fear, but from a storm of thoughts she could not set straight. Her husband's grave lay only a short walk behind the cabin, and she still carried his memory like a wound that would not heal. Yet here stood a man who seemed less flesh than fate itself, demanding her future with a voice that left no room for argument. She opened her mouth to speak, but the words tangled and failed her. In that silence, the mountain man's shadow stretched across her threshold as though the wilderness itself had claimed her home. The villagers waited, their eyes darting between the widow and the man who had brought winter into their midst. Wind rose then, sweeping through the narrow street, rattling the shutters, carrying with it the faint howl of something wild from the ridge above. It was a sound that seemed to echo the mountain man's growl, a reminder that the wilderness had its own rules, and those rules were not written in law books or sermons. The widow's hands trembled against the rough wood of her doorframe. She could feel the town's eyes on her, the weight of her late husband's memory, and the raw command in the stranger's voice. Whatever choice she made in that moment would shape not only her own fate, but perhaps the future of the entire settlement. And just as the silence deepened, a sudden crash split the night hooves pounding against the frozen earth, a rider tearing down the slope with a shout that cut through the heavy air. Every head turned toward the sound, and the mountain man's pale eyes narrowed. Something or someone was coming fast, carrying news or danger that would shatter the standoff at the widow's door. The widow drew in a sharp breath, her heart caught between terror and a flicker of hope as the rider's voice grew nearer. The mountain man did not move, but the tension in his stance told all who watched that the next moment would decide more than just one woman's future. The town braced, the river whispered under ice, and the widow clutched the door as though it were the only thing keeping her upright. The rider's words finally rang out, though the meaning of them was swallowed by the roar of the wind. Faces turned pale, the mountain man's jaw tightened, and the widow's breath caught in her chest. Whatever message was carried into that frozen night, it promised to change everything. The rider came hard down the slope, horse foam spraying from its mouth, the echo of iron shoes striking against frozen rock carrying across the settlement. The townsfolk stepped back from the street, their breaths showing in clouds as they strained to hear the words being shouted. The rider's voice was rough, torn from his throat by cold air and fear, yet clear enough to set hearts beating faster. He pulled the reins tight as the horse skidded to a halt in front of the saloon, the beast's flanks heaving, steam rising into the night like smoke from a forge. The mountain man's gaze never left the widow, though his body had shifted, a subtle turn of his shoulders that placed him half toward the rider, half toward her door. He did not speak, but the line of his jaw carried the weight of questions no one dared to voice. The widow stood frozen, her hand still pressed to the rough wood of her cabin, her eyes wide, torn between relief at the interruption and dread of what the news might mean. The rider swung from the saddle, boots hitting the frozen ground with a heavy thud. His face was pale under the dirt and sweat, and he looked as though he had been riding without pause for days. "They're coming," he gasped, voice low but steady enough for all to hear. "From the North Ridge. Raiders, maybe. More. 20, maybe 30. His words hung in the air, colder than the night itself. A murmur swept the street. The saloon doors creaked as men spilled out, rifles half raised, fear flashing in their eyes. Mothers clutched children tighter, and the old blacksmith spat into the snow, muttering a prayer through his cracked lips. Trouble in those hills was no stranger, but 30 men riding together meant something different. It meant a storm far greater than what the small settlement had ever faced. The widow's breath caught. She remembered the stories her husband used to tell on winter nights, tales of marauders who swept down on small towns, leaving nothing behind but ashes and silence. She had thought those stories belonged to another time, to places far away. Yet here it was, riding into her own doorstep. The mountain man finally moved, stepping closer to the rider. His voice, when it came, was low and steady, carrying farther than one might expect. "How long?" "An hour, maybe less," the rider said, pulling his coat tighter around him. "They were crossing the ridge when I cut through the pass. They'll be here before the moon's at the tree line." The mountain man's pale eyes swept the street, measuring the faces, weighing the strength or weakness of the people gathered there. He said nothing for a long moment, only the faint grind of his teeth breaking the silence. Then he looked back at the widow, and though no one dared to admit it aloud, it seemed as if his words before the claim he had laid had somehow twined with this new danger, as though the two were bound together by some fate only he understood. The widow's chest tightened, torn between fear of him and fear of what was coming over the ridge. Her cabin had once been her shield, but now it felt like tinder waiting for a spark. She knew that whatever force rode toward them would not spare the weak, and in that realization came another. She was more alone than ever, even surrounded by neighbors. They would protect their own, and in their eyes she had become marked the moment the mountain man spoke his claim. The people looked to him now, not to the sheriff who stood stiff at the end of the street, hand trembling near the grip of his revolver. Authority meant little in the wilderness when the weight of survival pressed down. And the mountain man, silent and cold as the peaks, seemed to bear that weight as if it were his birthright. He finally spoke again, and though his words were few, they struck like iron. "Board your doors. Keep the women and young inside. Fire only when you must." He did not ask. He commanded. And though no man there wished to admit he was following another's orders, the shifting feet and nodding heads told the truth plainly enough. The widow felt the air grow heavier still. His command might protect the town, but it left her in a place she could not yet name. Was she to obey him as the others did? Was she now folded into his will as firmly as he had declared? The question burned inside her, but no answer came. As the villagers scrambled, nailing shutters, dragging barrels and wagons into the street to form a crude barricade, the widow lingered at her door, watching the mountain man as he stood alone. In the center of the street, pale eyes fixed on the north. His figure seemed carved from the land itself, immovable, the kind of man storms broke around rather than through. And yet, in the hollow of her chest, fear grew heavier, for she did not know whether he stood as her shield or as another force. A fate ready to consume her. Her thoughts drifted, unbidden, to the night her husband had fallen ill. The fever had burned him hollow, leaving her to hold his hand as he slipped away. The neighbors had whispered prayers outside, but none had entered. She had faced that darkness alone, and since then had built her life around the silence it left. Now, as the sound of hammers and shouts rose in the street, she wondered if the wilderness itself had come to take that silence from her. The rider who brought the warning sat slumped on the saloon steps, eyes glazed with exhaustion. Men moved around him, arming themselves, muttering about powder and shot. Some swore vengeance for old raids long past, others feared this night might be their last. The widow caught fragments of their words, each one pulling the knot in her. Stomach tighter. As the moon lifted higher, a strange stillness settled, as if the land itself were waiting. Even the dogs did not bark. The mountain man finally turned, his eyes finding the widow once more. He walked toward her door with slow, heavy steps, each one crunching against the frozen ground. The town seemed to fade into the background as he drew near, until only the sound of his boots and her quickening breath filled her ears. He stopped a few feet from her, his shadow stretching across her porch. For a long moment he said nothing, his gaze steady, unreadable. Then, in that low growl that carried like a winter storm, he spoke. "The ridge brings death tonight. Stay close, or you'll be taken with it." Her lips parted, but no words came. She wanted to ask what he meant, wanted to demand who had given him the right to command her life. Yet the look in his eyes, cold and steady as the mountains, held her voice captive. Something in him was unshakable, and it frightened her more than the raiders could. The sound of distant hooves reached them then, faint but steady, like thunder rolling down from the high peaks. The townsfolk froze, tools and rifles in hand, eyes wide. The widow's heart pounded, her grip tightening on the doorframe until her knuckles burned. The mountain man's head lifted slightly, listening, his jaw set like stone. The first flames appeared on the ridge, torches swaying in the dark like restless stars. Shouts carried on the wind, wild and harsh, growing louder as the riders descended. The barricade across the street looked small now, fragile against the tide that was coming. The widow's breath shook in her chest. She wanted to retreat into her cabin, to hide in the dark and pretend the storm would pass her by. But she knew better. Nothing passed untouched in the wilderness. She could feel it in her bones. The truth her husband's stories had always carried. Survival was not given. It was claimed. The mountain man stepped closer, his voice rumbling low so that only she could hear. "You'll stand beside me, or you'll fall with them." Her heart jolted at the words, torn between terror and the strange pull of his command. Behind him, the flames on the ridge grew brighter, the shouts louder, the hooves nearer. The night itself seemed to close in, pressing hard against the little settlement dot, and as the first shot cracked through the air, echoing like thunder against the mountains, the widow's hand slipped from the doorframe. Her fate, like the town's, had been sealed in the space of a breath. The riders were upon them. The first shot cracked the silence apart like dry timber splitting in the fire, and then the night roared alive. Hooves thundered against the frozen ground, shouts carried across the street, and torches flared bright as the raiders spilled down the ridge. The barricade trembled as men rushed to their places, rifles raised, hearts hammering hard enough to be heard in the quiet between gunfire. The widow pressed herself against her doorframe, the world before her spinning into chaos, yet her eyes never strayed far from the mountain man. He stood in the center of the street, calm as stone, as though the storm around him was nothing more than a wind he had long expected. Smoke curled from the barrels of rifles. The townsfolk fired wildly at shadows moving along the tree line, their fear pulling the triggers faster than their aim. Some bullets struck true, cutting down figures that tumbled into the snow. Others whistled into the dark, wasted. The raiders answered with their own gunfire, sparks spitting from the ridge, bullets biting into wagon boards and splintering cabin walls. The widow ducked low as glass shattered from her single window, shards scattering across her floor. Her heart pounded in her ears, and she clutched the rough wood of her door until her palms burned. Through it all, the mountain man did not lift his weapon, not yet. His pale eyes tracked the ridge, reading the movement of men and horses with a patience that stood in sharp contrast to the frenzy around him. When he finally raised his rifle, it was slow, steady, deliberate. He fired once, and a rider toppled from his saddle as if plucked from the night by unseen hands. He reloaded without hurry, his movements precise, as though time bent to his will. The sheriff shouted commands, but his voice was thin, lost under the roar of chaos. Men hesitated, looking not to him but to the mountain man, and followed his silent lead instead. The widow felt it too, that strange pull he carried, the way his stillness spread a kind of order even in the storm. She hated herself for noticing, for letting her gaze cling to him when she should have been praying for her own strength. The raiders pressed closer, their torches now bright enough to throw wild shadows across the cabins. A few broke from the main group, circling wide to test the barricade's edges. The widow caught sight of one rider darting along the side path near her cabin. Panic clutched her throat as the man raised a torch high, flame licking the cold air. She stumbled back into her home, snatching the water pail by her hearth, her hands trembling so badly she sloshed half of it onto the floor. Before she could move again, a heavy thud rattled her door, the torch-bearer striking against it with the butt of his rifle. Her breath caught sharp, fear rooting her to the spot. Then came the mountain man's growl outside, low but carrying like thunder. A single gunshot followed, close enough to make her ears ring. Silence fell on her porch. When she dared to peek from the doorway, she saw the raider sprawled in the snow, the torch guttering beside him, the mountain man standing above with his rifle still smoking. His eyes met hers briefly cold, unshaken, and then turned back to the ridge. She pulled back inside, clutching the water pail against her chest, her breath ragged with both terror and something she could not name. The fight dragged on, minutes stretching into hours. The town's rifles cracked until barrels smoked and hands blistered. The raiders pressed, pulled back, pressed again. The widow lost count of the dead scattered along the ridge. The air grew thick with the bitter smell of gunpowder, with smoke from torches and chimneys alike. Somewhere down the street, she heard the cry of a child, cut short by a mother's desperate hushed out as dawn edged faintly into the sky. The raiders shifted. Their shouts grew louder, harsher, as if a new order had been given among them. They withdrew slightly, circling at the edges, no longer pressing as before. The townsfolk dared to breathe, thinking perhaps the tide had turned. Yet the mountain man's stance did not ease. He lowered his rifle but did not relax, his gaze still fixed on the tree line. He knew, as the widow began to understand, that this was not retreat. This was a pause, a breath before something worse. When the shooting slowed, tension twisted into the marrow of every soul on that street. Men hurried to drag the wounded inside. Women pressed cloth to bleeding flesh. Children peeked through shutters with wide, frightened eyes. The rider who had brought warning sat slumped by the saloon, too weary to lift his head, his face ghostly pale in the dim light. The sheriff moved from man to man, trying to spark courage, but his words carried little weight now. It was the mountain man they looked to, though he gave them nothing but silence. The widow tended her own small fire inside, hands shaking as she tried to warm water to clean the blood from her palms where splinters had cut deep. Her mind replayed the sound of his voice. "You'll stand beside me, or you'll fall with them," over and over, until she could no longer tell if it was warning, command, or curse. She remembered the way his eyes met hers after saving her from the raider at her door. Cold, steady, but not cruel. What kind of man could stand in such chaos and not waver? And why, of all people, had he set his claim upon her? Outside, whispers of fear grew into talk of betrayal. Some men muttered that the raiders must have known too much about the settlement, its size, its defenses. How else could they have come with such numbers? Eyes turned toward strangers, toward drifters. Some looked even toward the widow, a woman alone, too quiet, too much of an outsider though she had lived there for years. She felt their suspicion like a weight pressing against her cabin walls, though none dared accuse her outright while the mountain man kept near. His presence alone seemed to push their questions back into their throats. By mid-morning, smoke rose faintly from the ridge where the raiders gathered, their campfires twisting into the pale sky. They had not left. They had settled. The townsfolk knew then what it meant. The fight was not over. The raiders were waiting, watching, readying themselves for another push. Supplies would run thin, powder and shot would dwindle, and fear would gnaw the edges of every heart. The settlement had been turned into a trap, and winter itself was closing around it. The widow found herself staring at the ridge through her window, her breath fogging the glass. She thought of her husband's grave, of the quiet life she had tried to build from loss. Now all of it stood balanced on the edge of another storm. And at the heart of it stood the mountain man, pale-eyed and unyielding, as if he had been shaped for such nights. She could not escape the truth that he had bound her name to his in front of all, and with danger pressing in, that claim hung heavier than ever. That night, as the town held its breath in uneasy silence, the mountain man came once more to her door. He did not knock. He stood, shadow heavy across her porch, and spoke low enough that only she could hear. "They'll come harder next time. When they do, you'll not hide behind wood and fire. You'll stand where I tell you." His words were not cruel, but they cut all the same, leaving her trembling in the doorway. She wanted to fight back, to tell him she was not his to command, that she was her own. Yet when her lips parted, only silence came. She saw in him not only force, but certainty, a certainty she had never felt since the day her husband died. And she feared more than the raiders, what it meant if she let that certainty pull her into his shadow. Above them, the ridge crackled with torchlight once more. The raiders stirred, their cries carried on the cold wind, a promise of blood to come. The widow clutched her shawl tight, heart hammering, as the mountain man's pale eyes fixed on the darkness beyond. The night was far from over, and the true storm had yet to break. The second night came heavy, the air thick with smoke and silence. The ridge still glowed faint with torchlight, as though the raiders meant to remind the town that they had not gone, that their shadow stretched into every corner of the settlement. The people barely spoke, their words hushed, their eyes fixed on doors and windows as if sound itself might draw trouble down upon them. Even the saloon, once the noisiest place in town, stood quiet, lanterns dimmed, men drinking in silence as they listened for hoofbeats in the distance. The widow sat at her small table, her hands wrapped around a tin cup of cold tea she had brewed hours earlier. She could not drink it. Her mind spun with the mountain man's words, his claim, the weight of his presence that had pressed deeper into her life with every passing hour. He had saved her from the raider at her door, yes, but in doing so he had bound her name tighter to his in the eyes of every soul who watched. She felt it each time she stepped outside to fetch water. Each time a neighbor glanced at her cabin, fear, pity, and suspicion all wrapped together. Alone, she had been marked as weak. Now she was marked as his. Neither place offered peace. Outside, the mountain man stood at the edge of the street, rifle across his back, pale eyes fixed on the ridge. He had hardly moved since the night before, as though carved from the earth itself. A few men lingered nearby, pretending to work on the barricade but truly waiting for any word from him. The sheriff paced at the far end of the street, his badge glinting faintly in lantern light, though no one looked his way. Authority was measured in survival now, and survival was tied to the man who had come out of the wilderness like a storm. The widow finally rose, her body tense, and stepped onto her porch. The air bit sharp against her skin, carrying the faint cry of coyotes in the distance. The mountain man turned his head slightly, his eyes finding hers even before she spoke. She did not know what she meant to say, questions about the raiders, about his claim, about what he truly wanted. But when she opened her mouth, no sound came. His stare held her still, as if the answers she sought were locked in a silence he would never break. She retreated back inside, heart pounding, hating herself for it. The hours dragged. The settlement slept in uneasy snatches, always one sound away from waking. And then, sometime deep into the night, the quiet broke. A single horn blast echoed from the ridge, long and low, carrying through the cold air like the call of something ancient. The widow jolted upright from where she had sat half dozing by her hearth. Children cried, dogs barked, and men rushed into the street, rifles clutched in shaking hands. The raiders came with fury this time. Their torches blazed brighter, their shouts louder. rolling down the ridge in a storm of fire and sound. The barricade shuddered as they struck it, horses screaming, wood splintering under the weight. Gunfire cracked sharp and fast, filling the night with smoke and sparks. The widow pressed herself against her door, heart hammering. As the world outside shook with violence, she caught glimpses through the small window, men falling, shadows surging, flames licking across a wagon wheel. And always in the center of it, the mountain man. He moved through the chaos like he belonged to it, his rifle steady, his steps unhurried. He fired with precision, never wasting a shot, his pale eyes tracking targets as if he could see through the smoke itself. Each time he pulled the trigger, another raider fell. Around him, the townsfolk rallied, their fear tempered by his calm. But the raiders pressed harder, driving closer to the cabins. One torch arced high, landing against the roof of the blacksmith's shop. Flames roared up, lighting the street in a hellish glow. Men shouted, trying to smother it, but the fire spread too fast. Panic rippled through the settlement. Women dragged children into root cellars, men split between fighting and saving what little they owned. The sheriff tried to gather order, but his words were drowned in the roar of flames. The widow's cabin shook as another rider struck against her porch, this one forcing his way toward her door. She stumbled back, breath sharp in her throat, searching for anything she could use. Her hand found the old hunting rifle her husband had once carried, resting above the hearth. She had not touched it since the day he died, but now her fingers gripped it tight, the weight of it both foreign and familiar. Her hands trembled as she raised it, pointing toward the door. The door burst open, a shadow filling the frame. She pulled the trigger. The recoil slammed into her shoulder, the sound deafening in the small room. The raider staggered, clutching his arm as blood darkened his sleeve. He snarled, lunging toward her, but before he could reach her, another gunshot cracked. The man fell, eyes wide, and behind him stood the mountain man, smoke curling from his rifle. He stepped into her cabin without a word, his presence filling the small space. His eyes flicked to the rifle in her hands, then back to her face. For a moment, he said nothing, but she felt the weight of his gaze press into her bones. Then he turned sharply, stepping back into the storm outside. She followed to the doorway, the rifle clutched tight, fear and fire mixing in her chest. The battle surged harder. Raiders broke through parts of the barricade, spilling into the main street. Men fought at close quarters now, the crack of rifles giving way to the clash of knives and the dull thud of fists and boots. The widow watched in horror as neighbors she had known for years fell into the snow, their blood soaking into the ground. She wanted to look away, but she could not. The storm had swallowed them all, and there was no escape. Through the smoke and fire, the raiders' leader emerged. He rode a black horse, his coat lined with wolf fur, his voice carrying above the chaos. His orders cut sharp, and his men surged with new force. He was larger than most, his face marked by scars, his eyes burning with a cruel fire. The widow felt a chill deeper than the cold wind. This was no ordinary raider. This was a man who had come to claim, to destroy, to make the settlement bend or break. The mountain man saw him too. Their eyes met across the smoke-filled street, and for a moment the world seemed to still. The widow felt it, the pull of two storms colliding, a force greater than any she had known. She could not hear their thoughts, but she knew in her bones that whatever passed between them would decide the fate of all. The raider leader raised his hand, and a wave of his men charged toward the mountain man. Shots rang out, knives flashed, and still he stood his ground. He fought with a cold precision, each movement deliberate, his pale eyes unyielding. Yet for every man he dropped, two more pressed forward. The widow clutched her rifle tighter, torn between terror and the strange pull to step into the fight herself. The flames spread, smoke choking the air, the heat pressing against her skin even from her doorway. The cries of the wounded rose above. The gunfire, the desperate prayers of women mingling with the shouts of men. The settlement was breaking, its strength faltering under the relentless storm, and in the center of it, the mountain man advanced, step by step, toward the raider leader. His figure loomed against the firelight, his rifle steady, his growl carrying low through the chaos. The widow's heart pounded, her breath caught, as she realized the moment was coming, the clash that would decide whether the town lived or died. But before it could come, a scream split the air. A child's voice, high and terrified, cutting through the battle. The widow's eyes snapped toward it, and her blood ran cold. A small figure had darted from one of the cabins, caught between raiders and fire, stumbling into the open street. The mountain man's head turned sharply, his gaze locking on the child even as the raider leader raised his weapon. The world seemed to hold its breath, suspended between fire and silence as both men moved at once. The widow's cry caught in her throat, her hands trembling on the rifle. The storm had reached its peak, and whatever came next would shatter everything. The child's scream carried like a blade through the smoke, sharper than the crack of rifles, sharper than the roar of fire. The mountain man moved first, his boots cutting across the snow with a speed that belied his size. The raider leader, mounted high, raised his pistol, firelight gleaming against the barrel. Time seemed to slow, each breath stretching into forever. The widow gripped her rifle so hard her knuckles whitened, unable to look away, unable to act, every part of her body locked in terror. The gun fired. The sound split the air, and the child fell forward into the snow. But before the scream of grief could rise from the town, the mountain man was there, his arm sweeping the boy into his chest. The bullet had struck his shoulder, spinning him halfway around, but he did not falter. He shielded the child with his body, his pale eyes blazing against the smoke and fire. A roar erupted from the townsfolk. The sight of him standing bloodied, yet unbroken, ignited something in them that had nearly been lost. They surged forward, their shots no longer scattered but sharp and sure, their cries fierce with newfound resolve. The raiders faltered, their leader pulling hard on the reins of his black horse as the wave of resistance struck. The mountain man staggered but did not fall. He placed the child in the widow's arms as she rushed into the street, her heart wild, her hands trembling. She pressed the boy close, tears streaking her smoke-stained face. When her eyes lifted to the mountain man, she saw not only the cold force that had claimed her, but the fire of someone who had placed himself between death and the helpless. Something in her broke then, though she could not name whether it was fear, grief, or the first hint of trust. The raider leader bellowed, his scarred face twisted with fury, and drove his horse straight toward the mountain man. The clash came at last. The street seemed to narrow to just the two of them, one shadow of wilderness against another. The widow watched, clutching the child, as the mountain man braced himself, rifle raised. The leader's shot rang out, grazing past him, but in the same heartbeat the mountain man fired. The black horse reared, the leader tumbling from the saddle into the snow. For a moment, silence fell. The raiders saw their leader down, the fire of his rage snuffed, and their cries faltered. Some tried to rally, but the townsfolk pressed hard, their courage doubled by what they had witnessed. The raiders broke, retreating back toward the ridge, their torches dwindling into the distance. The battle that had seemed endless ended all at once, leaving only smoke, blood, and the ragged breath of survivors. The widow sank to her knees in the snow, clutching the boy as sobs shook her body. Around her, neighbors stumbled from their cabins, faces pale but alive, some carrying the wounded, others dragging buckets of water to douse the flames still licking at the blacksmith's shop. The sheriff, shaken but breathing, stood leaning against a post, his badge darkened with soot. For the first time in many hours, the sound of children crying was not met with fear, but with relief. They had survived. The mountain man stood in the center of it all, his shoulder bleeding freely, his rifle hanging loose at his side. He did not look at the townsfolk, did not seek their thanks. His eyes found only the widow, and for a long moment they held each other across the battered street. No words passed between them, but in that silence she felt more than any vow spoken aloud. He had claimed her once with a growl, but tonight he had claimed something greater, the right to be seen as more than a shadow from the hills. Days passed before the smoke cleared and the town began to piece itself back together. The barricade was repaired, the wounded tended, the dead buried in the frozen ground with prayers whispered over them. The raiders never returned, their leaders fall breaking their strength. Yet even in peace, the memory of that night lingered in every corner, shaping the settlement in ways words could not. The widow worked beside her neighbors, patching roofs, cooking meals for the wounded, carrying water until her arms ached. She no longer felt the same hollow space inside her cabin. Loss still lived there, but it was no longer the only thing. When she stepped outside, she was no longer just the quiet woman at the edge of town. Eyes still followed her, but not with suspicion. They had seen her stand in the storm, rifle in her hands, and that had marked her as surely as the mountain man's claim ever had. He stayed on the edge of the settlement, never asking for a place, never demanding more than silence. Some whispered he would leave once the snow melted, returning to the peaks where men like him belonged. Others said he had rooted himself deeper than anyone could see, tied not to the town, but to the woman he had chosen. The widow herself did not ask. She lived her days one at a time, though each night she felt his presence, steady as the mountains that loomed above them. The boy who had been saved clung to her often, his parents having been lost in the fight. She took him in without question, her cabin echoing less with loneliness now. Sometimes she caught him staring at the mountain man with wide eyes, as if the pale-eyed stranger were something out of legend. And maybe, she thought, he was. When spring came, the settlement bloomed back to life. The blacksmith rebuilt his shop, the saloon doors swung lively again, laughter rising where once only silence had lived. The scars remained, but so too did the strength they had found in the hardest of nights. The sheriff, quieter now, wore his badge with less pride and more humility, often glancing toward the ridge as if remembering how fragile the town had been. One evening, as the sun dipped behind the peaks and painted the sky in fire and gold, the widow stepped onto her porch. The mountain man stood a short distance away, his figure outlined against the fading light. For once, he did not turn away when she met his eyes. He walked slowly toward her, each step deliberate, his pale gaze steady. He stopped at the edge of her porch, the place where he had once spoken the words that bound her fate. This time, he said nothing. His silence carried more than his growl ever had. She felt the weight of it, the choice within it, and for the first time since her husband's death, she allowed herself to breathe without fear. She set her hand lightly against the railing, her voice soft but clear. The storm's passed. He gave a slight nod, the faintest shift of his jaw, but in it she read an answer. The storm had passed, yes, but what remained was theirs to shape. No longer just claim and fear, but something forged in fire and survival. The boy's laughter rang from inside the cabin, carrying out into the evening air. The widow turned toward the sound, then back to the man before her. Her life had been remade, not in the way she had once imagined, but in a way she could no longer deny. The mountain man stepped back into the shadows as the night settled in, leaving her porch as he had so many times before. But now she knew he was not leaving her. His presence would linger, as steady as the peaks, as constant as the cold wind. She would not face the silence alone again. In the quiet that followed, the widow lifted her eyes to the ridge. The land was scarred but alive, much like her own heart. And though the storm had torn through them, it had also revealed a truth she had long buried, that life in the wilderness was not only about loss, but about the will to endure, to stand, to claim a future even when darkness pressed hardest. The town would remember the night of fire and blood. They would remember the raiders, the flames, the scream of a child. But more than that, they would remember the moment they had stood together, bound not by law or fear, but by survival and courage. And at the center of that memory stood a pale-eyed man from the mountains, and a widow who had found her strength beside him. As the stars came out, bright and cold against the endless dark, the widow closed her eyes and let the night wrap around her. The story was not one she had chosen, but it was hers now, woven into the land, into the town, into the life she would carry forward. And though the mountains would always loom with their silence and their shadows, she no longer feared what they might bring, for in that silence she had found more than loss. She had found a way to live again.